And good afternoon, Singapore. In these last 2 days, we've heard some great presentations with practical recommendations and a theme about building constructive relationships between security teams and DevOps teams. And I am here to put an end to that. Or perhaps I'll rephrase that. I'm here to help end the day on that note. So the title of my presentation is actually, quite honestly, rather boring. Instead, what I usually like to do is start off with a metaphor of the American West. And by that, I mean an Italian movie filmed in Spain. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is Sergio Leone's 3-hour epic Western. It's about 3 gunslingers who form shifting, uneasy relationships as they search for a hidden cache of stolen gold. Blondie, he's the Clint Eastwood character. He's the good. He has this quote, $200,000 is a lot of money. We're going to have to earn it. Well, bug bounties also have a lot of money, and most of the time you have to earn it, as well as if you're running a bug bounty program, that can be a pretty expensive proposition. So one of the things we want to explore here is how are we going to invest our time, how are we going to invest our money, and how can we find that hidden cache where we're doing so in a way that's efficient and cost-effective. So Clint Eastwood also has another great line. You see, in this world, there's 2 kinds of people, my friend. Those with loaded guns and those who dig. Now, that is highly motivating, but it's not very collaborative. So whether we're trying to gather more information about a bounty report to get some details about reproduction steps, or we're handing off vulnerability information to developers, we should do so in a way that really emphasizes participation and empathy. That's been one of the underlying themes of these past 2 days. Because after all, we want to avoid that moment when Lee Van Cleef's character shows up and reminds us at gunpoint, 2 people dig a lot quicker than 1. And of course, there's the third, Tuco. He's played by Eli Wallach. He's the ugly. He has a fantastic line. There are 2 kinds of spurs, my friend. Those that come in by the door, those that come in by the window. In other words, we're always going to have vulns. So our applications either already have vulnerabilities or they're going to have vulnerabilities. Ideally, we're going to find them before they reach production. Unfortunately, that's not always the case. What we want to do is find them in production in a way that minimizes the risk to the application's user, their data, and the application systems. You can sort of think of this as 2-factor AppSec. Something you know, something you have. You know there's going to be vulns. You have hope that they won't be exploited before they're found and fixed. And if you cross your fingers while this is biometric 2-factor AppSec. So what this boils down to is this idea of how are we going to discover those vulns. We have bug bounties, pen testing, even scanners that we'll get into. But we have an overarching goal to fix vulnerabilities, but we have a lot of different motivations for getting there. We have bug bounty hunters who are asking, what's the price for this vuln? And who are very often incentivized to find the highest impact or argue for a higher impact vuln so they can get a better price for it. You have a DevOps team. They're asking the questions, what's it going to cost me to fix this vuln? My time is valuable. What's it going to cost to our deployment pipeline? What's it going to cost to our deadlines? And then there's also the idea of what's the value? Should we bother doing this type of vuln discovery? What are we getting out of it? And so calling out those nuances, there's difference between those ideas of price, cost, and value. And hopefully throughout the next few slides, we'll get a little bit better sense of how we might quantify that or how we can sort of think about that in general. Before we go too far, I do want to take a slight diversion into talking about bug bounties and vulnerabilities and the herds and the hordes that are out there. So vulnerability disclosure itself could be an epic 3-hour discussion. What we'll do is just focus on under an hour, more of that aspect of optimizing our time and budget. But I do want to focus on a few things. One of, for example, is the term of art currently is coordinated disclosure, with the opposite implication being uncoordinated. That's a little bit more value neutral than saying responsible or irresponsible, or even at the very far end of the spectrum when bug bounty reports are almost indistinguishable from something like extortion. But if you want to learn more about this, I highly recommend looking at the work by Katie Moussouris, who has done this for well over a decade very well regarded and expert in this field, is very much focused on the ins and outs and how to go about, how to approach vulnerability disclosure. So with that aside, let's actually dive into some numbers. If we're talking about metrics, metrics of course need numbers. And what's actually really cool is that bounties are one of the few areas where we have strong numbers. In other words, the price of a bounty, for the most part, reflects the risk associated with a vulnerability. So you might have a $50 cross-site scripting that can only be, it's a self-cross-site scripting, a very low impact. Or that other end of the spectrum, you might have a $10,000 cross-site scripting because it can be delivered to anybody's inbox in a web-based email system and extract sensitive information, let alone cookies or something like that. So you have this wide variance. And on average, in bug bounty programs I've been familiar with, the average price of a vuln was around $800. And in some more publicly reported data, I've seen the average be around $1,000. So keep this number in mind because we're going to revisit it as we build some models and we talk about metrics. One of the other things I want to do as we build this idea of models and build this idea of metrics is, what about the work that's going into bug bounties, or what does this wisdom of the crowd look like? What we might discover, spoilers, is that the entire crowd itself is not uniformly wise. There actually may be a very small cohort of people that are earning the majority of the money, or equally reporting the majority of the vulnerabilities. So that's something that we want to know about, we should be aware about, and there's a reason we want to do that, and we'll get to that reason shortly. I'm going to try to keep you in suspense as much as possible. So as I build suspense, basically going to revisit and start to reformulate our question, which really just says, we want to know where our flaws are, we'd like to find them, but how can we do so effectively? We care about time, we care about money. Two very important things. Also two very important tracks off of the dark side of the moon. So, more metrics. Noise. Notoriously, bug bounties have a lot of noise. What I've shown here are vulnerabilities that have been reported through pen testing as well as through bug bounties. And this over here, where I'm pointing out on the right-hand column, is the valid. So roughly from the metrics I had available, around 87% of the vulns from the pen testing were valid, and about 33% out of bug bounties were valid. This probably, the bug bounty number is probably close to other industry numbers. The point here being that the noise is going to be a distraction, or noise is something you have to filter out. But there's also stories we can start to tell and things that we can interrogate about our data. And it's not always the fault here of bug bounty researchers that we get duplicates. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to highlight that column. Duplicates can also be a measure of your DevOps speed, or the maturity model, and the speed with which you can respond to vulns. So if you get a vuln report on a Friday afternoon, and you're able to push out a fix by, well, we heard earlier today, you could actually push out a fix on Saturday morning, or maybe we want to take the weekend and the fix doesn't come out till Monday. That's a good way of minimizing how many duplicate reports are going to come in for that vuln. However, if you're not able to fix that vuln in a matter of days, let alone weeks, or worst case, let alone months, you're likely going to get a whole lot of duplicate reports for that vulnerability. So it's not just the case that duplicate is noise, because a lot of people are telling you what you already know. It's also an indicator that you don't necessarily have a robust enough development process to be able to fix quickly those vulns that do come in. So here's our first insight. Not really too earth-shattering, probably something that we could have predicted before we even started this presentation, but it's the idea that, yes, there's noise out there, and all these vulnerabilities, call them false positives, call them just distractions, they're going to make us less efficient, and they actually cost money. So they cost money if we're going to outsource the people who are going to do the triage for our bug bounty program, or they just cost money for hourly rate for contractors, etc. And what we want to do is try to avoid paying for this noise as much as possible. And to do that, we're going to continue to collect more metrics, and we're going to build a model, sort of a mental model about our vuln discovery efforts to figure out how well are we using it, how can we optimize it. Now, before we continue with some additional metrics, one of the things I wanted to make sure was to set the tone that nothing about this is trying to position bug bounties or pen testing as one better than the other. They're very different beasts. They serve a very different purpose. And what we're going to look at is ways to think about how we might align them either with the rate of our development process, the size of our development team, the size of our security team, or even just how many eyeballs do we want to throw into our AppSec program. So one of the other things that we can say about this is what's interesting here is that that big outlier of the most reported, well, there's a whole lot of cross-site scripting because cross-site scripting is kind of the cockroach of the internet. It's just everywhere. It's never going to go away, unfortunately. But there's also a lot of misconfiguration. And if most of the findings coming from our pen testing and coming from our bounty programs are related to misconfigurations, maybe we're even overpaying for that information. For the most part, scanners should actually be pretty good at identifying these types of misconfiguration problems, especially something as simple as the TLS cipher suite or what protocols are enabled, something like an SSL labs or what Hardenized can provide us. And even with like a configuration management in our CI/CD pipeline, those are great ways of fixing those misconfigurations so we're not paying someone a large hourly rate or large bounties just to tell us something that that scanner should have told us already. Whereas scanners aren't going to be as good with something like probably authentication in sessions. They might not even be as good as sensitive data exposure if they don't understand the context of what actually is being exposed. So set that aside and let's move on. And we'll take our first dimension and look at the dimension of time. Partially because I'm a Doctor Who fan, so I like to bring in time and time-related references into my presentations. In this case, we're talking about efficiency in time and pen tests versus bug bounties. So as you might guess, when you pay for a pen test, you're getting a lot, I'm not going to say all, but you're getting a lot of vulns in a relatively fixed time period. Over a bug bounty, you may get the exact same number of vulns. As we saw from this previous slide, they track pretty closely to each other. There are experts out there in the bug bounty world, just as there are experts within pen testing. The point here is that it may take you, rather than 2 weeks, it may take 2 months or 100 days or a full year to get the same number of vulnerabilities that you might have gotten out of a pen test. So what if we also then switch from just looking at time to also looking at the cost? There's some ways, if we just looked at bug bounty reports and how they build and build over time, on average, there's going to be a certain time where they're cost effective, meaning they're below that line where you'd actually pay for a pen test. So that's great. Possibly you're actually saving money by just having a bug bounty program because there's not that many vulnerabilities coming in, or you don't have a whole lot of huge outliers that are those $10,000, $15,000 types of vulnerabilities. And over time, however, that may increase. So a bug bounty, or sorry, a pen test may only be a 1 week or a 2 week effort. But afterwards, you're going to have 100 days, 200 days. So maybe you're going to find that same number of vulns you would in a pen test. It's just going to take longer to get there. So in a way, it could be a measure of your patience or a measure of your expectation. Now, the other thing to think about here, and what this doesn't capture, is the rate of releases for your application. So one of the things here is that this sort of assumes we developed an application, we deployed it, and then nothing changed. So obviously, applications do change. We heard again earlier today, an application being deployed 20 times a day. Obviously, that's pretty massive, a very fast rate of change. But there's some other metrics, again, spoilers, or keep you in suspense, that we can talk about how to match up how we're doing vuln discovery with this type of frequency and rate of change. Again, trying to not jump around too much on you, but I wanted to make another reference to a fantastic sci-fi movie from 1981 called Scanners, but talk about web application scanners that are near and dear to my heart because they represent automation. And one of the tenets of DevOps that I like to really emphasize is automation and feedback loops. So feedback loops, a very basic engineering principle. Automation, also a very basic engineering principle. So I don't have a lot of data around scanners, so that's why you don't see them in a lot of my graphs and metrics. But we can already assume that they're going to have a lot of overlaps in what pen testing can do or what bug bounty can do. For example, if you're paying bounties based on things, somebody who's been running an Nmap, somebody who's been running OpenVAS or Nessus, you're basically subsidizing people to run scans that you should be doing yourself. So again, that's probably a wasted amount of budget and wasted effort. If you're getting those types of vulnerabilities, start investing that money into scanners. The same thing too is that if we were to throw them onto this graph, they would likely be down in that lower left-hand corner where they're efficient in time and they're cost-effective. Doesn't mean they have a zero cost, but it means we can use feedback loops. If we get a bug bounty report in a production system, now let's go back and adjust one of our QA tests, one of our acceptance tests, one of our development linters to see, can we find this vulnerability within our code so that we can watch for a regression, as well as can we take advantage of this scanner that's not only watching for a regression, but look for this same vulnerable pattern elsewhere within our code base. So that's where scanners and automation are going to be a fantastic help for us. So let's go back to that idea that I alluded to before about the pace of development or the frequency of deployment and tie that into as a parallel to the frequency of bug bounty reports. So what I did here is I looked at reports and I just said, how many days are there between valid reports? And 50% of the valid reports came within roughly 4 days. And 95% of them overall had about 22 days in between them. So there's a couple things we can take from here. If we're thinking 4 days between valid reports, we can say, great, we're probably going to get 2 reports a week for our application. And if we say on average that's $1,000, we can already sort of set up some expectations that we might be spending $100,000 a year on this application for bug bounty. Now, obviously, things are going to change. Your applications may be very different. But this is helpful in the sense of saying, what's going on in our environment, and how can we start to gather some informative metrics to help us with forecasting or just give us a sense of how worried should I be about this application, or how much money am I going to have to spend on it. If we're imagining we're going to spend $100,000 on the vulns for this application, maybe we actually want to invest in a WAF and get rid of a lot of the whole swaths of these types of vulnerabilities. Or we'll pay for consultants, or we'll pay for something else to come in and help us. There's a couple other things that we can also think about this. In making sure I don't fall off the stage, in 2016, there was roughly 33 days, about a month, in between valid reports, at the most. So what we could say here is that we set up a program for our application. It's been a month since we had the last valid vulnerability submitted for it. What does that mean? Well, we might be optimistic and think that all of the vulns have been found. Or perhaps it means that all of the interesting or the easy vulns have been found. It's been a month. So that maybe will give us a sense of confidence. If it's a legacy system that doesn't change very often, maybe that month is a really good indicator that yes, in fact, we actually have scoured and cleansed that application of all the really bad vulnerabilities. If it's an application that's constantly changing, and it has been a month since we've gotten our last valid vulnerability report for it, maybe it means something else. This is where you have to be perhaps a little bit more pessimistic. Perhaps it means that the bounty hunters are uninterested. Maybe they did find all the easy cross-site scripting, but they wanted to move on. And they don't want to bother looking at the OAuth implementation. Or they're not aware that there's a new feature that's been released that may actually have some new cross-site scripting vulnerabilities in it. Or perhaps they got bored. Or because there's a particular market for bounty programs, maybe you're not paying enough. Maybe at this point you can say, our average payout was $1,000, but now we're going to up it to $2,000. Or perhaps we're going to say, we'll pay $5,000 for this particular class of bugs because our program is going stale. So these are different ways that by having a few numbers that can be informative, we can start to make some decisions. We can start to make some hypotheses and then test them and say, if we increase the bounty for this, do we start to get more valid reports coming in? There's some other things that we can do to take advantage of that. So I mentioned the size of crowds and just how wise are these crowds really? Well, in this case, it was about 8% of the researchers were responsible for 50% of the vulnerabilities reported on this platform. So if you had 1,000 people, pretty much 80 of them are responsible for half of the reports. So one thing we could say, it's been a month since we got something valid for our application. Rather than try to double the size of the participants from 1,000 to 2,000 within our bug bounty program, what if we went and found those 80 people and said, dear 80 people, we're going to give you a fixed price. For this week, here's some money. Please go take a look at our application again. Or we're going to pay you double for our normal bounties for you 80 people because we've seen that you produce quality work for us. So these are ways we can switch incentives to help us rather than perhaps driving undesirable behavior. So it could be much more helpful to say, who in our program, who are these 80 people? Let's find them rather than just say we want bigger and bigger and bigger programs and doubling the size of those crowds, for example. Now, I've been comparing bug bounties and pen tests, so it seems fair to say, what did the data look like for pen testers? In this case, about 15% of the pen testers were responsible for 50% of the vulnerabilities, and about 2/3 of them were responsible for 95% of the vulnerabilities. So this is close. Again, pen testers are probably more focused. They may have a higher average number of years of experience. But there's also something that this doesn't capture. Pen testing typically is engaging someone to take a look at your application and follow through on a methodology. So rather than play sort of that slot machine mentality of bug bounty programs and say, can I find that easy SQL injection or that really impactful cross-site scripting or that low-hanging fruit that's easy to find, what should happen is that a pen test will go through that methodology and give you that feedback that says, yes, you have these vulns that were present, but here are some areas where we saw some good application design, where here's some positive feedback about what the application did well in terms of security controls. So it's one of the things, too, is that numbers can capture certain aspects of information, but I really wouldn't rate a researcher just on the number of reports that they generate, because it's also important to not only find out what our flaws are, but what we're doing well, getting that positive feedback about the application. So that's one of the other underlying themes here that I want to emphasize is that we're trying to not abuse metrics too much or read something that isn't supported by them. And we are still going to make some claims here that hopefully will be at least supported by opinion, of course, if not maybe some data as well. And those big claims I'll say is that most vulns, in fact, may just be noise, and many vulns perhaps aren't even worth fixing. Now, I say this in the spirit that a bug is a bug, and they should be addressed. A lot of vulnerabilities just may fall into a category of code quality, something like missing an HTTP-only cookie versus something that's like a RCE in a Java framework, like struts. That's clearly a security bug. So here the idea is, what vulns are we seeing? Is it just an observer effect? Is it because XML entity encoding just jumped onto the OAuth's top 10 this year, so therefore everybody's looking for XXE, and it's not like suddenly there's more of them, there's just more people looking for that particular vuln. Or is there something like vulns that are being reported, being labeled as vulns, but they don't really impact the security or, importantly, a privacy context within the application. So a bug's a bug, it should be fixed, but that's more of a code quality issue. We'll talk a little bit about that and more, but if I were to try to summarize that, my take on this phrase would be, we'll always have bugs, eyes are shallow, or eyes get tired, or they get bored, or they aren't aware of a particular bug class, or there's a new bug class that came out. For example, that example of XML entity encoding, or clickjacking. Clickjacking was, came onto the scene everybody was reporting it. We had X-frame options being demonstrated, and X-frame options was a great example of having a framework level, if you will, way of destroying an entire bug class. But I think there are some valid arguments to be made of just how impactful could a real-life exploit be from clickjacking versus other types of vulnerabilities within web applications. And part of this, if I'm trying to beat a dead horse or reiterate my point, is saying, do we have a bug ops team or do we have a DevOps team? And again, here's where I like to call out that idea of a culture that is either just maintaining the status quo, trying to fix bugs, move on to the next bug, or is this a culture of engineering that's embracing automation and using feedback loops? Using those feedback loops to say, why is this the 15th time we've had this cross-site scripting bug? Is it because we're using git blame and we can see who's been committing this? Is it because the developers don't have the right tools, or we don't have good feedback, or we don't have good linters, even just to acknowledge, or to identify, I should say, that these vulnerabilities are coming in? So this is really where I like to emphasize that idea of DevOps and DevSecOps. This idea that we have monitoring in production to provide feedback loops for us. And one of the things I would argue is that security is going to be an emergent process from DevOps, meaning let's have a process, let's have some automation, and let's actually use that to reduce vulnerabilities. And as an example of that, I like to talk about HTTPS. So since easily the late 90s, there's a doom and gloom crowd who's saying the sky is falling, we should be using HTTPS. Developers, go use HTTPS. HTTPS everywhere. Come on, please use HTTPS. We're going to start blaming and shaming you for not using HTTPS. Nice, but not really helpful. What Let's Encrypt did, at least in my mind, was turn that sort of coercive approach and just like yelling at people to go deploy HTTPS into a more collaborative approach. They identified what does a DevOps team need in order to actually effectively deploy HTTPS. And there's two key aspects to this, I think. One is the initial cost. So the cost is now zero. Certs are free. Awesome. So we addressed the issue of budget. But that's a one-time problem. The other problem is ongoing maintenance, meaning how do you deploy, how do you maintain, how do you rotate certificates when they expire, or in unfortunate scenarios, what if they're compromised? And not being able to, that idea of key rotation or certificate rotation is critical to an effective production scale deployment of HTTPS. If you can't rotate your keys, you effectively don't have good HTTPS, especially if you don't know when they're going to expire and you can't update them. So that's why I like to highlight what Let's Encrypt did, is to say, cost is free, and here's your Acme protocol. So all of the DevOps teams now can basically deploy HTTPS certs, not only in production, but now these certs are also so easy to obtain, they can be in your staging environment and your dev environment. So also no longer do we have those kludgy code where developers are disabling those certificate checks about self-signed certs or invalid certs. You've got valid certs everywhere and a lot more encryption. And this is a great thing. And I think what I like to call out about that is it's also a way of doing applied threat modeling. Now, threat modeling in general, I think, is a great exercise. It's a great way just to build security awareness. It's something that you can do with your DevOps team, and security can guide that process. But it's a great way for security to identify or find out what are developers struggling with. Maybe, what are their areas of ignorance? What do they not know about? And it's a way to say, what are you trying to do? Let's try to do that securely rather than just saying no. And it's something that can influence design and it can inform implementation. And threat modeling is another important aspect, for example, to bug bounties. When you're trying to go back to say, here's a $50 vulnerability, here's a $15,000 vulnerability. It's based on realistic threats. It's not based on a threat that says, well, if it's a Friday afternoon and the planets have aligned and somebody clicks on this, then they do a sequence of 4 other things, then they're going to be exploited. That's something that's a likelihood that's probably pretty low and is not a threat you should necessarily be concerned about. And what this is leading into is this idea of risk reduction. So we're not trying to attain perfect security. So to bring us back to the idea of metrics and numbers, a lot of ways we want to manage numbers, we want to increase something or decrease something. Now, I'd probably strongly argue that we're not trying to attain 100% security. We're trying to lower risk. And we're not going to get to zero risk, but we're going to reduce it to sort of that background radiation of the internet, where you have people just running Nmap, running Zmap, running Metasploit, an APT or a non-APT, but just all that noise that happens in the internet. That's where you're trying to reduce the risk to. And a lot of this comes from fixing vulnerabilities. So a lot of the graphs I was showing earlier was about discovering vulnerabilities, using bug bounties, using pen testing, for example. What I have now are some some observations, I'll say, about what did it look like from what we saw about vulnerabilities being fixed. Here are vulnerabilities that I pulled out and classified by broad categories. So these roughly map to the OWASP top 10. And I think they tell a story that seems reasonable. If we look to the top, SQL injection is up there. So that far side, that left-hand side, that means they were fixed much more quickly than average. And down here, we see redirects and forwards took quite an outlier, took much longer than average to fix. And in a way, that kind of resonates. Redirects and forwards actually fell off the OWASP top 10 this year. So our data kind of seems to support that. That makes sense. And what it tells us, here is what not the security team necessarily is prioritizing. Here's what developers are prioritizing. Here's what they're fixing and fixing quickly. And here's what they're not fixing so quickly or not caring about. Now, another way to look at this data is to say, rather than vuln category, what was the risk of that vulnerability? And again, we would have expected, or at least we would have hoped, going back to our two-factor AppSec, we'd hope that the critical vulns would be fixed more quickly, and the negligible or the least critical vulns, yes, those can take a little bit longer. Here we see something a bit more messy. Now, I haven't had time to dive into this data to come up with would be a strong answer, but I'm going to use it as an exercise to say, how do we interrogate data? Or how can we kind of dummy check, if you will, or just build some hypotheses or some stories about that data that we'll go and then follow up on later. So this, below medium, there's an outlier there that those are getting fixed a lot quickly. There could be a couple reasons for this. One, perhaps we're mismanaging to a metric. One of the traps of having metrics is that we want this number to go down or we want this number to go up. What if we want the number of vulns to go down, or we want our SLA for fixing vulns to go down very quickly? Maybe these vulns are this outlier, this green line. Maybe those were just the easiest vulns to fix, and developers were motivated by lowering the metric, and they just wanted to fix the easiest vulns. That's great, but that metric drove some perverse, it was a perverse incentive. It drove some undesirable behavior because, sure, they were fixing vulnerabilities faster and they closed a lot of those bugs more quickly, but you could ask, did they actually really reduce risk? And that's what we care about. So maybe that's one story about that, or that's one at least trap to be aware of if you're managing to a very specific metric or not stepping back to look at the bigger picture. But there could be other reasons. There could be more optimistic reasons about that. One could be maybe these are vulnerabilities that were just destroyed by a framework change. Maybe the dev team said, we're going to invest and switch our front end and do a big investment, but a big shift into something like React.js. It's much, much harder to introduce cross-site scripting vulnerabilities into React. So maybe that just got rid of a whole swath of vulnerabilities there. Or they deployed CSRF tokens on their development framework. And by one framework change, CSRF went away. Or maybe, for example, that's the clipjacking with extreme options. So there could be some stories around this, but it's something to look at and be aware of about what's the data we're collecting, and is it reflecting what we might expect? And if it's surprising us, let's dive into a little bit deeper to figure out what that surprise might be. And as I mentioned, there's a big picture to be aware of. So ultimately, we do want to fix vulns. We don't just care about knowing what our flaws are. It's of course nice because we want to fix them, but fixing them is where we're actually reducing risk. And despite those categories and the average days of fewer or greater vulnerabilities being fixed, whether by category or whether by risk, we were barely getting above 50% fixed. So overall, the big picture, that's not great. Now, we should still be supportive, still be constructive and say, this is still good because the critical vulns, at least, are the ones that are above that 50% line, and the less critical aren't. But again, what if we were actually to step back and have a conversation about this? What is this implying? Maybe it actually means that a lot of these vulnerabilities don't really matter. Or maybe they just fall into that category of code quality versus actually having a security impact. So maybe we're actually we're taking in too much noise from a bug bounty program, or we're passing on too many vulnerabilities from our automated scanners or from our pen tests. Maybe we should just focus on one or two categories, get rid of, lower this baseline so that we see the risk that's getting fixed is the risk that we actually care about. So maybe we're actually measuring something and the 50% line is actually much better than we care about because we can get rid of a lot of the noise. So we'll take a risk-based approach to that. And another way of looking at this data is, because I like using metaphors, I like to talk about a endemic risk. Or I take this metaphor of the American Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They're the organization that tracks things like plague outbreaks and important things like zombie outbreaks. You can go to their website and you can look for how to prepare for a zombie outbreak, and you will find a report on such a thing. So you've been warned, and now you can be prepared. But the idea here is that we have outbreaks of vulnerabilities. You could also look at this as sort of your blood splatter chart. If this is the first time you've ever dumped your application into a bug bounty program, it's never been tested before, you get a wave of vulnerabilities that come in. But the idea here is that a lot of what I've shown has been kind of snapshots in time. What's often more important is a trend. So as I was mentioning, we want numbers to go up or numbers to go down. In this case, we want to see applications move from that pandemic quadrant where we have a huge outbreak of high-risk vulns and tons of them, to make matters even worse. We'd love to get them back in that lower left-hand corner where they're just sporadic, where we have the acceptance, where we acknowledge that there will always be vulns, but if we can fix them quickly, and if the impact of those vulns has been reduced because we have compensating controls, because we can deploy a WAF rule change quickly, because our CI/CD pipeline has a lot of tests in it that allows us to deploy quickly with confidence, meaning that this code change, we don't have to cross our fingers. We can just look at our test acceptance dashboard and say, we're pretty sure that these lines of code aren't going to break our production system. That's another case where I like to emphasize that mentality of DevOps, where you have automation, feedback loops, and a CI/CD process with a whole lot of touch points. So again, this is just another way of just looking very, very simple numbers nonetheless. In this case, I'm using risk as just impact times likelihood, scale of 1 to 5. You could also perhaps track this as CVSS v3. Collect this from all of your different scanners, all of your different reporting tools, and say number of findings. Or you could just change what these axes are, but still have the idea that in February of 2018, our app was up here in the pandemic quadrant, but we did something that at least said we're still getting a lot of findings, there's still a lot of bugs here, but we at least reduced the average risk for it, eventually getting it down to that sporadic. And you can also perhaps measure this with your bug bounty program. Maybe you could say, how mature is our DevOps program? Or how mature, or how quickly do we think we can fix vulns, or have we killed entire classes of vulns? Maybe we're paying, if we're just going to get a whole lot of vulns, 1,000 vulns, or that 100,000 vuln reports, we don't want to pay much more than $1 for that vuln because it's just going to bust our budget. But maybe we have a good program in place. We're still, pretty low on the maturity model, but we can pay that average $1,000 for bug bounties. So you're just kind of enumerating, figuring out what the flaws are. And then eventually you're increasing order of magnitudes on payouts because you're starting to exterminate whole classes of vulns. And I use it, I like alliteration. I also wanted to use exterminate so I could make another Daleks reference. So that's the other reason for that. And then if you're increasing on and on, You can get to the point where you've increased the magnitude of your bounty payouts till you're making certain types of vulns just extinct. They just shouldn't happen unless there was some egregious failure, both within the developer awareness, the developer process for code reviews, the automated linters that you have, the automated tests that you have, and the design that you've created for your application. So that's where you can see very mature companies are able to say $100,000, $250,000 for a fundamental flaw within our operating system, within our chip design, things like this. So if I were to try to start to summarize this, your security from crowds can still come. You may have a cast of thousands in your epic bug bounty program, but it may only be those 80 people or so, or that 8% or 12% or so, that are giving you all of those really reasonable, really good reports based on reasonable threat models. If you're getting them in, put those vuln reports into your issue tracking system where the developers live. Work with the developers' tool sets. Don't force them into different tool sets, different tools. Bring those CI, and when you're talking about automating reproduction steps, bring that into that CI/CD pipeline. It is fantastic to introduce new tools, but make sure they work within the ecosystem of what DevOps uses, rather than try to convince DevOps to create a whole new ecosystem. And one of the things too, shift left, the very common phrase. I like the idea of being shiftless because automation lets us be lazy. But one of the things I want to emphasize from this presentation is that I'm not trying to say find those vulns earlier, do a bug bounty or do pen testing earlier on that SDLC. It means shift the security knowledge, shift what you're doing with security earlier within that SDLC. Do you even have security controls? We make, we make fun of people for having bad passwords, but we also, as developers and DevOps teams, we have passwords for our service accounts. How do we handle keys? How do we do our secrets management when we're deploying to staging environments, when we're deploying to production within cloud environments? These are important things to understand. And we can do security from the very basics. Again, there's nothing earth-shattering about me saying, know where your apps are. Scanners can be very helpful for this. Enumerate those dependency graphs. We saw today and yesterday some great examples of what happens in that app dependency. It's one thing to say, fantastic, you've done some great code reviews, you have a nice process designed around the code that you're actually writing. What about all that code that you're importing? So let's not forget that. And of course, let's figure out, let's not fall into the Druids principle where no one knows who they were or what they were doing. Who actually owns and is in charge of the apps you have? And one of the ways I like to summarize this, and it's one of my goals is to try to get myself quoted somehow, is that AppSec is the continuation of DevOps by their own means. So this is sort of my on cyber war or my on politics of cybersecurity, meaning give the DevOps team the tools and information that they need in order to build security controls, process into that CI/CD pipeline, and act as that consultant, act as that participant, and act with empathy and understanding what are the real challenges they have, rather than what are the things that you really worry about because you went to a security conference recently. It may not be the case that Meltdown Inspector should be your highest priority when you're dealing with trying to eradicate cross-site scripting vulnerabilities from your web application that's not on a shared computing environment. So again, just that idea of a risk-based approach. So, going back to our three gunslingers, the American West itself is rife with mythology, and Sergio Leone's films are definitely even more so. So mythology in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. It gives us grand stories. It gives us insight on things like the human condition. In other scenarios, it just merely entertains or gives us a time capsule on well-intentioned but perhaps ill-informed thought. But with metrics, we can revisit AppSec mythologies and our understanding and our appreciation of them. So whether you're aiming for a fistful of vulns from a pen test or you're just looking to bug bounties for a few dollars more, use metrics to guide that strategy. Because after all, $200,000 is a lot of money. Let's spend it wisely. Thank you. And with that, hopefully, everyone has some questions, or they're eager to leave for the afternoon after such a great conference. And I see one hand already. So yes, questions.
So all of those metrics that you got, are you sharing those somewhere?
So I can't share the raw data for it,
okay,
but the slides have been posted. And again, we'll be posting the slides. And I believe DevSecCon will be posting the videos for this as well.
Very nice. Cool. Thank you. Also, can I ask more questions? Okay. Do you have, because you had so many great ideas, do you have like a list of like, kind of like, if you're going to strategize between these different options like bug bounty or pen testing and all of these things, like, I would love to see like one of those charts where it's like, if this, if that, because I'm a nerd and that's how I think.
So that's a great question. So the mic might have been quiet. So the question was, do you have a flow chart that says, if you're this worried, you should do this. If you're not as worried, do this, and so on and so forth. So that is a great question. I should have, I don't have a recipe of this, and this that I think is great for all contexts or for all apps. Because I'm very much a fan of saying, what's the context for this? However, if we're going to go into napkin math, napkin metrics, I would say never start with a bug bounty program. Do an internal security program first for your application. Do a pen test. Do something that's basically bounded on cost and bounded on time to say, what do we think our baseline is for the security of this application? Then open the doors to the hordes of the internet to say, what are all the vulnerabilities here? What did the pen testers miss? As well as, pen tests are still a point in time. So applications live throughout time, however wibbly wobbly it may be. So there is a good place for having bug bounties as an ongoing monitor, if you will, of that. And the other thing I will say, always look at automation because that's going to be the best thing from a DevOps mentality. So that's perhaps a bit vague, but that's how I would start to answer that question.
So as you look at the places where bugs weren't fixed, have you started to dive into the whys? Are they aggregated to certain companies, or are they aggregated to certain behaviors? How do you think about going after that problem, because that's how you get to the next level with those particular companies? Absolutely.
And in the interest of time, I had a whole bunch of other graphs and things with pretty colors to show off. One of the things I was looking at is, I was talking a lot about averages, but there's another thing. What about the median? What do those graphs look like for the companies, the organizations that are doing really, really well? So on average, I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, I think over all the orgs, it was something like 79 or 80 days was that average time to fix. For the orgs that were doing really well, it was much closer to 30 to 45 days. So this data was definitely skewed by a lot of outliers from companies that just weren't fixing vulnerabilities. So there is a way to go and say, start asking those questions of what's wrong? Do we not have, good incentives? Do we need a more of a carrot and stick approach, or why are these being ignored? Or not to be overly cynical, are these the types of companies that just say we need a pen test because we need to meet some particular requirement, or we need to satisfy a third-party vendor security questionnaire? So there are a lot of things that can go in there. I haven't looked into it in too much detail just to try to figure out what's the difference between companies that are doing really well and those that aren't. And there was no commonality I saw, at least in terms of size of company or industry vertical or anything like that. So it's one of those things that, if I'm lucky, a year from now I'll be able to come back and maybe be able to answer that question a little bit better. Other questions? I'm standing on this side of the stage, so I feel bad. So I'll wander over here, and our poor camera guy has been trying to track me as I pace back and forth. But I don't want to ignore this side, so we'll just awkwardly stare at each other until Francois tells us that we're done for the day, or if anybody has questions. Okay. Yes? So if the question, if I understood correctly, is there a rule of thumb about you have an application, what's the rule of thumb that you might expect for a bug bounty or to spend on a pen test for it. So typically, applications are different, and the influence is different. I would say just using my, my math of saying $100,000, maybe expect that, because you might get 2 vulnerabilities a week. The average price might be $1,000. Better way, I guess, a better way I might explain that is that if you haven't done bug bounties before, talk to somebody who's done bug bounties and make sure to don't start from scratch to say, here's our email address, let us know, and we're going to try to figure out how much we pay. Look to see, I'm trying to figure out how to answer this concisely. Let me step back and say, has the application ever been tested before? If it hasn't, don't do the bug bounty. If it has, you're probably in that category of $0 to $5,000 range is a common range for bug bounty. Don't look at somebody like Google and Facebook and Apple because they have massive user populations that can be put at risk. They have massive budgets for that. Look for these other areas. So it's basically the other reason I'm stumbling for an answer is that it's hard to say how many vulns does an application have. So a couple other ways you could do that is say, run a pen test first. Find out over a 2-week period, typically pen tests are on an hourly rate, something like that. How many vulnerabilities did they report? If they reported 10 vulnerabilities, 2 of them were high risk, and the 8 of them were medium, say 2 high risk vulns might be a $5,000 bounty, 8 medium risk might be $8,000. And so maybe that's something to start a budget with, or say, we're just going to experiment. We're going to open the doors on this bounty program for a month, and we have a $20,000 bucket. If that bucket is spent before the end of the month, we're done. If not, we'll keep it open for another month. So there are a couple different ways of strategies for approaching that. And the reason I can't give you a great answer is because the context is a lot different between, are you looking at this very single application? Are you looking across enterprise? Are you looking at what the type of the application might be? So hopefully that helps a bit. So yeah, I understand. I'd love to talk more about that and find some more, find some more details because then maybe I can answer a little bit better. So. Other questions? My voice hasn't completely gone, so I could probably answer at least another question. Yes.
Thank you. I just want to ask if the bug bounty data includes black market bounty or just the normal bug bounties publicized?
So the bug bounty data here is a combination of both public and private programs. So they've been kind of mixed together. Often private programs tend to have filters, for example, of who participates in them. So for example, if you were to look at that graph where I show that 8% of the people were reporting 50% of the vulnerabilities, private programs tend to be just that 8% of people. So that's actually, to go back to your question, that's saying, questioning how to get into, how much to spend on a bug bounty program. Starting with a private closed program with a few dozen people may be a good way to start because those people might be more incentivized to be friendly about it, give you higher quality reports, and so on. So hopefully that answers your question about the composition. So. Okay. So the other angle of the question was, so this was bug bounty data, private, public programs, and then what about dark market or selling vulnerabilities on outside of bug bounty programs? Short answer is no. None of this data included that. For one, I had no access to such data, and also to a degree, my theory behind it would also be that there's a lot of applications out there for which there is no black market for such vulnerabilities. Facebook, Google, Apple, those are easy examples of here's a pwn to own where you have competitions where this is a $100,000, $200,000 reward for these types of vulnerabilities. Clearly, there would be a market of a black market, a dark market for such things like that. But for a B2B SaaS application that very few people know of, it's unlikely that there's a black market for such information. So it's definitely a gap there. I would be curious about what that actually looks like. but I don't have any good informed opinion or informed opinion about that. So. Cool.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mike.
Well, thank you.